Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Leah Palmer, and I am a student at the Winterthur University of Delaware Program in art conservation. And this year, I became intimately familiar with a ceramic flask that is in the Winterthur Objects Collection as I took care of or conserved it. So, over the next 30 minutes, I want to take you with me as I walk through the process of conserving this piece. So conservation involves a lot more than bench work, encompassing a whole suite of processes. So we will start with close looking, examining this object from every angle, and then we will move on to research, linking what we see with what we know about cultural heritage over time. Then we'll perform a condition assessment. We'll summarize what this object's vulnerabilities are, and then I'll explain the curatorial consultation that I had which led to multiple scientific analyses that then ultimately led to the treatment that I performed. So by the end of this presentation, I hope that you have a strong grasp on the type of work that conservation actually entails, from research to talking with experts to actually putting hands on the objects. And perhaps you'll find new paradigms for how you can care for your own objects. So I'd like to first briefly answer the question, what is art conservation? So we likely all know what conservation means in a broad context. We talk about it in the context of ecological conservation or conservation of mass and physics. Um, and that's the careful maintenance of something to keep it from disappearing. Here's a concept of like keeping around what we already have. So I like to describe art conservation as the holistic care of material culture, caring for both the material components as well as the intangible qualities of an object for communities in the present and for generations to come. So to me, this means not only caring for the actual brick and mortar of the object, but also telling its story. Conservators often think of this field as standing on three pillars, science, art history, and studio art. And so science is integral in conservation because it involves understanding the material characteristics of objects, how they degrade, how conservation treatment will affect them. It involves art history, wherein we are able to better contextualize the artworks that we're working on within their communities, within their socio-historical context. And it also involves studio art or hand skills, where conservators actually cultivate a practice of dexterity through the use and knowledge of artist materials. So in the conservation treatment of this object, our first step is closely examining the object. So let's do that together. So this is a glazed flask. It's shiny. This means that it has been dipped in a glassy coating that has been fired and then vitrified, meaning that it is now impervious to liquids and can hold liquids inside of it. Down at the bottom, we can see that it is a pale-bodied earthenware ceramic. That means that the clay is really porous, and it has been fired at a lower temperature than something like porcelain. It has a rounded lip, it has a flared neck, and then it has this inscription on the front that says, "Fill me up, I crave a kick," with three initials TBG. It is slightly flattened, and we can see that the glaze has dripped down from the top, or it has been dipped completely. And as a result of that, it has adhered or fused to the inside of the kiln while it's been fired. And we also are seeing that there's a matte red overpaint in the areas of incised inscription. And just as an aside, we're seeing that there's this interesting craquelure crack pattern throughout the glaze. So after this close looking, we can start to do some research to ask and answer questions about the materials and the methods that were used to create it, which can then tell us more about the people behind the object and its story. So as we saw in our close looking, that this glaze has cracks, it has like a spider webby craquelure pattern throughout. It's throughout the object. And this is characteristic of lead glaze, which is confirmed when doing technical imaging of this object. Lead glaze typically fluoresces this kind of bright icy blue, and that's exactly what we're seeing. And so lead glaze was used because lead allows glazes to perform better at a low temperature. So the glaze can be fired and vitrify even at a lower temperature than needed to fire a porcelain. So this allows more accessible porous clay like earthenware to still be glazed and fired to a vitreous finish and then be used for um, food or liquid, despite earthenware being porous originally. So this is a bit of a spoiler as I had to open up the neck of the object later on in the treatment, but this allows us to see the interior of the neck. We see that there's some circular formations, some concentric circles that is indicating that the neck was spun on a wheel and then removed, is thrown on a wheel and then removed and then adhered to the or attached to the vessel. The inscription that we're seeing was likely carved and incised into the front of the vessel during the leather hard stage of clay, which is when the unfired ceramic is dry and stable, but it's still malleable enough for incision or carving and decoration. So, what do we know about the story that this object is telling us as a result of our research, as a result of our close looking? Well, from its shape, its flattened ovoid shape, and its materiality is an earthenware fired ceramic that's been glazed. This is likely a flask, and it was designed to hold an alcoholic beverage, a distilled spirit like brandy or whiskey or rum. And flasks like these are earth or these are stoneware, were often shaped this way in the 18th century and onward. And ceramic flasks like these were less common than glass, but they were often created using stoneware or earthenware. As flasks and alcohol began to proliferate in the 18th century and onwards, 18th, 19th century, we begin to see people putting them into their pockets. Women's pockets like these were worn under their petticoats, and then men had pockets, started having pockets sewn into the linings of their coat. So these small vessels could be stowed away in various locations. The inscription also tells us that this was a flask. This was even likely a humorous joke kind of gift for somebody. So the inscription says, "Fill me up, I crave a kick." And a kick in is defined in the dictionary of the vulgar tongue as a dram of gin or any other spirituous liquor. So it's becoming clear that this is a vessel that was designed to hold alcohol. And from the initials on the front, we can hypothesize that this was likely given to somebody or maybe just made by somebody for themselves to hold liquor as kind of a funny gag gift or whatever. So now that we have taken a close look at the object, we've understood more about its material composition and maybe how it was used in the context in which it was in. Let's see what has changed over time from its creation until now. So this flask exhibits evidence of spalling and glaze loss. So spalling is the cracking and loss of material on the surface of an object, and this often results from soluble salts having been imbibed or impregnated into an object. This can happen from something with salts or chlorides being inside a vessel. This often happens in archaeological contexts where vessels are buried in the ground where salts tend to, abound. In this context, it was probably a result of the liquor or the beverage or anything that was inside of the vessel. So this vessel has in its body solubilized salts that are kind of liquefied, kind of just living in it. But when the relative humidity around the object drops, these salts tend to recrystallize. And the expanding salt crystals push the glaze out, like off of the body completely. And so this is what we're seeing in these areas. There's glaze loss, and you can see that this glaze is gone, and now you can see the pale earthenware body underneath. So this is a prior join on the neck of the vessel. This is another condition issue. This did not happen at its creation, but likely happened later on after the object had broken and needed to be repaired. However, this was not done very neatly, and the adhesive that was used is spilling out over the edges. So that's it's very visible, and it's not necessarily something that the original artist would have intended, and it's not something that a curator now would like to see necessarily, because we don't know who did this. We don't know if it's significant to its history, but it is noticeable and catches the eye. And finally, it has overall surface grime, which is conservation speak for it's really dirty. So that is something we need to address. So it's time to assess the object's condition, which can range from poor to excellent, and poor meaning it's completely like outside of the realm of exhibitability. It's not very legible. And excellent is it's pretty totally fine. It aligns with what the original maker might have intended. Uh, its current condition, the presence of soluble salts, loss of glaze, sloppy previous repair, and overall dirtiness means that it's not in awful condition. It is displayable, exhibitable, but it definitely could be better. So we're going to say that it's in fair condition. The urgency of the treatment is dictated by the object's stability. It's not going to fall apart. It's fine standing on its own, but it's not 100% stable as the soluble salts have the tendency to reappear. So we're going to label it as fragile. So it's at this point that I had gathered enough information to consult with the glass and ceramics curator at Winterthur, Leslie Grigsby, in order to determine what the best treatment would be. So while speaking with Leslie, an interesting story began to unfold. So in her experience, a red overpaint like the one that we see here is very unusual. Usually, as she told me, color decoration on glazed ceramics of this period were comprised of an underglaze, which you can see on the left, which is heavily pigmented ceramic compounds covered with a transparent glaze, or enameling, which was made from melted glass powder. And in more modern times, people made like cold enameling or false enameling, apparently from epoxy resin. So it has that kind of same vitreous glassy finish. So this color decoration, though, was painted on top of the glaze, and that's something that Leslie rarely sees on original ceramic. So because of this, the paint was likely potentially added by a dealer or a collector who wanted to enhance the readability of the joke inscription on the front. So this means that it potentially was not original to the object. So if that was found to definitely be the case, Leslie said that she wanted me to remove the paint and return it closer to the appearance that the maker and the gift giver likely intended for it. But that would require some sleuthing on my part, which I'll talk about in a moment. So, in conjunction with Leslie, I determined that the treatment goal for the object was to stabilize the flask, to prevent further spalling and loss of glaze, and then to perform some aesthetic treatments to make it look a bit more whole, a bit more original while on display. So to start out my treatment process, I began by doing some analysis. I performed microchemical spot test analyses for soluble salts in the ceramic body. And this is where I took a sample and tried to determine if there were chlorides present, which is a common salt that we find and we see in ceramics. So I removed some samples from that area, and then I dissolved some of the sample in sulfuric acid and some in silver nitrate. And the sample dissolved in sulfuric acid reacted with the acid and formed hydrochloric acid, HCl, which is a very strong acid, and it proved the presence of chlorides or salts. And then the sample dissolved in silver nitrate resulted in silver chlorides, which became a cloudy white precipitate, which further demonstrated the presence of chlorides. So this means that we have soluble salts and that a full body desalination bathed immersion desalination would help remove soluble salts from the body, and then it would help ensure that the salts wouldn't recrystallize in the future and cause further damage to the glaze. So then I performed analyses of the paint binder to determine if it was likely a modern addition or original. So if the binder was definitely a modern material, something like cellulose nitrate or another material that was invented later than the 19th century, then we could be comfortable removing it. We'd be comfortable saying this was not original to the object. But if we didn't find that, we would have to leave it in place. So I performed reflectance Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy, or FTIR. And FTIR is a molecular spectroscopic technique that is often used in conservation to analyze organic materials like binders, paint binders, waxes, proteins, and some plastics. So it emits IR radiation, transmission FTIR emits IR radiation through a sample, and then it just sees how um, that radiation interacts with the sample. And if you get certain peaks or absorbances or reflectances, that aligns with a database of references. So you can compare the spectrum that you get to the spectra that you have in your databases and see what the similarities or differences are. So what did this tell me? Um, in both, so I'm sorry that this is a bit confusing, but I have two samples, sample one and sample two. Sample one, they're both named sample one, are red and purple, and then we have it compared to another purple spectrum that is a proteinaceous glue, rabbit skin glue. And so we really are seeing that there's significant peaks that all align. And for you chemistry nerds out there, I have all of the peaks there that show these are kind of typical markers for proteinaceous materials. So this could indicate that the paint pigment was bound using a natural adhesive like hide or rabbit skin glue. And this would have been very, very common in the 18th, 19th centuries. It's something that would have been used as a wood glue just in any context. So we cannot say for sure that it was not original. Um, we cannot say for sure that it was original, but there is a possibility that it was original. So we are keeping that paint on the vessel. So let's get into treatment. Um, I began by surface cleaning this flask very gently with a soft brush and a cosmetic sponge. And then because the paint was possibly original to the vessel, I didn't remove it, but I needed to see if the typical process for desalinating the vessel, completely submerging it in water, would affect the paint at all. And it did. It would. The paint was soluble in pretty much everything, including water. And so as a result of this, we determined that immersion desalination would not be possible and that I would pursue local desalination, which I'll talk about more in a moment. I then reversed the neck joint and I redid it later. But this allowed me to repair the previously rejoined neck, but it would also allow me more opportunity to access the ceramic body, which was available due to this open neck area. So, like I said before, desalination or removal of salts is typically done via bathing or immersion. So, the American Institute for Conservation's Wikipedia page describes this process as a standard desalination treatment involves soaking artifacts in water to remove enough of the salt so that the remaining salts pose an acceptably low risk. The concept is simple. If immersed in a clean freshwater bath, solubilized salts will diffuse from the ceramic object into the water, at which point the water and salts can be discarded. And if you harken back to your biology, you know that this is a hypertonic, hypotonic solution. There's migration of the salts from higher salt concentration to lower salt concentration. So this is the typical process. However, because I was not able to immerse this vessel, I went with poultice desalination, which is the same concept, but instead of putting it in a full bath, I'm using dampened paper pulp to draw out the salts from the body. So I put deionized water on the paper pulp. It's kind of mushy and wet. And then I pressed it against areas of the ceramic body that were not glazed. And then I wrapped the damp poultice in plastic wrap and then just let it sit. And then over time, the soluble salts were drawn out of the body through capillary action. And so I performed this action multiple times, recording the salt content of the dry poultice after I removed it off by soaking it in water and then reading the conductivity through a conductivity meter. So it's really difficult to estimate the total salt content of a vessel through just poulticing. So ultimately, the goal of this whole process was to just bring the salt level down a bit from where it began. So these points kind of display where the salt concentration was, where the conductivity was over time. And so you're seeing almost a bell curve situation where you start lowish, you go high, and then you go even lower. And that's just showing how the salts are being drawn towards the poultice. And there's a point where it gets quite high, where there's a lot of migration happening, and then the migration starts to slow. So um, hopefully I left the vessel with less soluble salts than it started with, and that allows it to be a bit more stable in the future. So now for the fun part, loss compensation. And as we recall, we have some glaze loss caused by the spalling. And this is not very super noticeable. It's not super disfiguring. This is something that could fully be left to show the age of the object, to show how it's degraded over time. It shows that it has gone through a life, it has history. But it will be on display in a museum at Winterthur. And curator Leslie Grigsby was very content with having these losses filled. And as long as they're documented, they can totally be reversed in the future if somebody determines that that's not the story that the object needs to be telling. So I pursued a fully integrated or mimetic loss compensation method, which just renders the losses more invisible. So this involves a couple of things. First, it involves inputting fill material. You're bringing the loss back up to the level of the surrounding area. So to do that, I used Flugger, which is kind of a plaster-like spackle material. Think about filling a hole in your apartment wall when you're moving out. And then you need to inpaint in order to get the color correct to the surrounding areas. So I used golden fluid acrylics to do that. And then I need to make sure that this shiny, shiny vessel matches with my fill. So I put some gloss medium over top this fill to make sure that everything kind of matches. And so here's the final result. Up close, you can totally see where it is, but I'll show you the after treatment photos in a minute. So there's one fill, here's another, and there's another. So these, if you're really looking for it, you can totally see it. But if you're not really looking for it, your eye just kind of skims over. And so this is the final result. Before treatment, we had something that was full of soluble salts. There was some glaze loss and there was a disfiguring joint on the neck. And then after treatment, all of that dirt, that grime is gone. It's a lot shinier. Those losses have been filled. And so you're not really focusing on these losses, but you're focusing on the whole effect of the piece. And the soluble salts, maybe not totally gone, but they are diminished. So here's the reverse. I thank you for walking through this whole process with me. We, as conservators, have the amazing job of, in a professional setting, getting to really know and care for our objects. And we get to learn about the stories behind each of these objects. And we work as hard as we can to get as close to the true story as possible, often in conjunction with people who really know a lot more about these objects than we do, like Leslie. So through close looking, research, historical context, condition assessment, consultations, analyses, and treatment, we are able to care for this object and find out more about the life that it has lived, which then allows for more informed decisions on how these objects are displayed. So as you go out into the world and interact with the various objects that you interact with on a day-to-day basis, your flasks, lamps, computers, paintings, anything. This process is something that you can do just in your whole life in order to better understand and then as a result better care for the things that you own. And make it just makes, I think, our interactions with the objects that we're around a lot more meaningful and sustainable. Because when we love objects, we care for them. And when we care for them, we keep them around for a long time. So thank you for going with me on this journey. If you have any questions about art conservation or the Winterthur program, or the treatment of this flask, please don't hesitate to reach out to me at this email address. And thank you again for listening.